Hello and welcome to Boxset, Binge the Bible, the podcast from Seven Vineyards, where we're listening through the entire Bible in a year. My name is Bern, Leckie. I'm joined by Owen, Lynch.
Hello.
We are in the middle of a big book called Chronicles, going over the history of Israel, and it's retelling it from a perspective which is a little bit different from some of the other bits in the Bible. That's what we thought last week. So we were noticing lots of similarities, but also quite a few differences. Has that continued? Have you been sort of sensing that's still the way things are going as we're looking at this sort of middle sections here, Owen?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I just noticed how it's a very polished version of David and Solomon, and I would use the word idealized. So particularly when you compare it to King Samuel and even Deuteronomy. One example of this is Deuteronomy 17, where we read that kings must not acquire great numbers of horses. I love that. And then in 2 Chronicles 1, Solomon acquires 12,000 horses and has so many horses and chariots that he has to have cities that are known as chariot cities just to accommodate all of the chariots and the horses. It's kind of like a head-scratching moment there. I thought a king wasn't meant to gather lots of horses, and yet Solomon has. So yeah, just things like that really kind of stand out for me. What about you?
It's almost like there is discussion going on within the Bible about what the Bible ought to mean.
Yeah.
about what people ought to pick up from it. And that's exactly the point, that this has happened through history, and at these different snapshots, these different periods in history, what the right thing to do from God, let's pass on from God what we think the right thing to do is. That does look different from time to time. So it's interesting you mentioned Deuteronomy, because that was another sort of summary retelling kind of text, and we thought at the time that had a purpose, and the purpose was probably, if the scholars are right, that it was written sort of on while Israel was on the sort of slippery slope towards exile, and were trying to remember who they were and who they ought to be, and look back at their history, maybe with a bit of a thing of, well, what do we need to do differently? Then it might have made sense to the writers of Deuteronomy to say, let's make sure that our kings don't go mad. let's have some good kings. And they'd had stories that were told through the book of Kings about how kings could go wrong and how things could go bad. And Solomon was part of that story. He was part of that problem because of some of the bad choices that he made. Now, that reminds me that Chronicles was written at a different time and for a different purpose, and so it does look different. And what do we think is the purpose of Chronicles? When was it written and why?
Scholars are fairly agreed that it's either during the exile in Babylon or after, when they return 70 years later. So I think there's definitely a sense that this is Judah and the associated tribes, Benjamin and a few others sprinkled in, and they're returning from there back to the land that's been laid waste by the Babylonians, to their homeland, to Jerusalem, and they're having to start again. And they're having to rebuild for the future, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple. And it appears that they are comparing a future expectation of a king, that they'll have another king, and that king will be like the best of David and Solomon. That seems to be the context for Chronicles. And indeed, in the Hebrew Bible, it's actually placed right at the end of the Hebrew Bible. They're like the last kind of writings, if you like.
Right.
That appears to be the context for it.
Right. So it's looking back at the same history, but from two different angles. From one angle in Deuteronomy, it's saying, look, here's all the stuff that could go wrong. Look at all these bad things that happened. And from the Chronicles angle, it's like, here are the things that we'd like to happen. Here's how it could all go right. This is our vision for a really good society. Oh, but it's one that we don't yet have, because in the exile, the Jewish people were scattered across the ancient world, and some of them became embedded in other societies, and not many at all were left anywhere near Jerusalem. But this was the call that was going to go back to people. Why don't we come and gather? Why don't we come and gather and do something? What should we do? Well, remember this thing that we used to do? Remember when God was right in the middle of everything we were doing? Remember how glorious and amazing that was? So it's highlighting all the good things about David. It's highlighting all the good things about Solomon. And the bad things just sort of don't don't get mentioned so much. They don't really fit that account. So what do we make of that then? What were the details that stood out to you as kind of like the most interesting or important? Maybe because they're similar to the rest of the Bible, or maybe because they're different.
Yeah, I was struck by just the nature of the construction of the temple, because of course, as we just said, they're looking at the ruined temple and thinking, right, we need to rebuild it. And so in Chronicles, we have a really detailed description of how the temple was built in the first place, what it was built out of, who built it, and then who was actually responsible for operating it. And a few things that struck out for me, like in 2 Chronicles 2, I was struck by the role of foreigners. And I use that word within the context of the Judeans. Like, they saw the people who weren't Judeans, weren't part of Israel, were involved in the construction of the temple.
They were, although albeit on what looked like a bit of a forced labour kind of basis.
Well, exactly.
So it says Solomon did a census to add to David's census. Now, David's census was a bit controversial, and Satan got the credit for David doing a census. Doesn't get the credit for Solomon doing a census, because look what came out of it. Loads of foreign workers. Amazing.
Exactly, yeah.
So now we've got people to cut the stones. Now we've got more people to carry the stones, and a few more people to be the foreman and make sure that all the other people are doing their jobs.
And it strikes me that I wonder, faced with the task of rebuilding the temple, whether they're actually trying to justify actually bringing foreigners in to actually rebuild the temple. They're saying, well, foreigners helped build the temple in the first place. There won't be many people left over from the exile. So I just wondered whether there was something in that. And also I was just struck by my goodness, what an enormous amount of money and wealth was spent on building this temple. Incredible amounts of gold and silver and precious stone and the best wood. And I think what I'm struck by as well is it's a real reminder for those Jews at the time, post-exile, that actually their kingdom under David and Solomon was quite impressive. It wasn't as impressive as the Babylonian Empire they've just been subject to, but there is an interesting point where the empire of Solomon and David is said to extend from the river Euphrates to the Mediterranean. Now, if you've got an idea of the geography of that area, the Euphrates is back in Iraq, back around where Babylon was, funnily enough. So it's almost like this sense of the Jews they've just returned from exile from Babylon, and they're being reminded, well, don't forget, the kingdom of Solomon and David extended all the way to Babylon, all the way to the Mediterranean. It was a big empire.
I wonder if the quality was even more important than the quantity.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Well, because God seems to, in the scriptures, always remind Israel that they're special because he chose them, not they're special because they were the strongest or the biggest.
Which they weren't, of course. Yeah.
Very much so. Also, when you look at Solomon, one of the things that stands out of Solomon is the quality of his wisdom, which meant that whatever his stature, whatever the size of his country was, he was sort of punching above his weight, really, because people would come, like the Queen of Sheba, would come from around the world to gain wisdom from Solomon, and that was described as originating really from God, and it came out of Solomon's request to have wisdom instead of wealth, and so he got both because God gave him both. And it's an amazing story, and I think I love how this is a sort of combination. It's a glorious combination of saying we had all this stuff going on, but it's also finding a way to give God the credit for it all. And it certainly gives God the responsibility as well for Solomon being wealthy. It's like, well, if you've got a problem with wealthy kings, go and take it up with God, because this is what God gave to Solomon. And I was also struck by how in the very lengthy descriptions of the temple, before you get to much of the stuff, all the stuff at the end of what we call the first book of Chronicles, just like the halfway mark really, all the stuff when David was alive, most of that's concentrating on people, the social order that is around the temple. So yeah, there was a little bit of stuff about, we're going to make some gold lampstands and things, but look how much description there is of all the people with roles, and the people had particular roles because they didn't choose them. It wasn't like a career choice they made. They were either born into the right part of the family, or within that right part of the family, then they'd been chosen by lot. Something had happened that was beyond their control, and so again, that would be, the credit would be given to God to say, well, God's given you this role. You didn't choose it, and so everyone knew their place. Both the people who were making the temple work itself, but also the other layers of people around that, the people with storage spaces and storehouses, and the army around them outside, making the whole society centered on the temple, centered on this social order. Yeah, absolutely, full of riches and blessing that they would credit to God. But I think the important thing that I'm getting from it is what they're looking for, and what the writers are hoping to draw other people into isn't just a set of religious things, but a whole life that is God-centered, and where everyone who comes will know that they have a place. I think that's really important. That's quite important in life generally, isn't it? Knowing that you have a place, knowing that you fit somewhere, that you belong, and that there's good things that can come out of your work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And knowing that you have a contribution to make, knowing you have a certain sense of purpose and identity, that's absolutely correct. And, I think this is, again, just super important for the remnant that have emerged from Babylonian exile and returned to Jerusalem. This is what they need to know. There was an order, and we're going to regain that order. We're going to restore that order effectively. Restoration, for me, becomes a key word. It's restoration of the kingdom of David. And of course, there's lots of prophecies around this time around, we read in other parts of Isaiah and places like that, where this kingdom will have a king again in the model of David. So yeah, do you know one thing that struck me, Bern, when I was listening and reading to 1 Chronicles, was I was doing both this time, was the role of the Levites.
Yes, it's slightly expanded, isn't it, in this version?
Yeah, right. And it's just really interesting to me, because the Levites were, by definition, when as tradition has it, when the 12 tribes of Israel passed the Jordan and entered the promised land, they all divvied up the land, and each tribe had its land. Well, the Levites didn't. And that's because they were tied to the tabernacle at the time. They had a role to carry the tabernacle, to administer the tabernacle, which was the place of God's presence, and they have the same role with the temple, and that's what we're seeing expanded on. And I was just struck, I don't know if you noticed this, just the many different roles that they have.
Yeah.
Whether it's the gatekeepers, that was a fascinating one to me, the treasurers, priests, and musicians. And did you notice how the musicians were known as the prophets as well? So it was the musicians who prophesied, which I thought was a really interesting thought.
I thought that was really interesting, and especially the way then there's so many of the sort of subdivisions of the family get given particular jobs to do, and it's so different from how we would think of like music ministry, prayer ministry. Like, come forward if you want to be trained and learn this, and if you feel that this is the sort of thing that you might be wanting to do. It wasn't like that then. it was no, God's doing this, and this is where the lot fell. So this is you on the worship rota, and this is and you're going to prophesy. Yeah, oh really? Okay, great.
Really interesting, isn't it? Did you notice as well, I was struck by, I just contemplated for what cymbals, harps, guitars, which is what a lyre is, I think, and trumpets would all sound like together. I just thought, what a noise. What also struck me was the Levites. There was this division of land, and we haven't really... Did we talk about this in the last podcast episode where we talked about the division between the North and the South Kingdoms?
No, because it only comes up in this bit.
Fantastic. Should we just talk about that? Can you just give us a brief overview of that?
Yes. Like with so many stories in the Bible, you have to reconcile the idea that this really good thing gets described, but then there's something bad happens, right? That goes all the way back to Genesis. Creation, it's all good. Oh, so how come there's anything bad in the world then? And same story here, really. You've got David, who was super good, and Solomon. Let's not mention his foreign wives and all the things that he. So in 1 Kings chapter 11, the split of the kingdom is basically pinned to Solomon and his sin. It says, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord. Although he'd forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon didn't keep the Lord's command. So God says, I will tear the kingdom away from you. Not the whole kingdom. I'll give one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and the sake of Jerusalem. So that's the description of God's promise to Solomon because of stuff Solomon did to split the kingdom. Not the same story here. Chronicles tells a different story. It places all the blame on Solomon's son, Rehoboam. And why does he get the blame? Well, his human resources skills are kind of lacking, and he doesn't know how to manage his people. They're saying, please, can you take some of our rubbish burdens away and spread out the work a bit better? We'd like some work reform, please. He goes and asks, this is the same story as before, he goes and asks the elders, the wise people, the people who were around Solomon, his dad, the wisest man in the world, and they give him some sound advice. They say, look, if you treat these people well, they'll be your people forever. Happy days. For whatever reason, Rehoboam says, oh, let me just get another opinion, asks his mates, the younger people, and they give him the opposite advice. They go, no, you need to be harder. And so that's what he does. And now, why is that story there? I guess it's turned here into a kind of a just so story for this is how the kingdom split then. We have to explain how the kingdom split. This is how it split. Because people looked at Rehoboam and said, mate, we're not going your way. We need to do something else. We haven't got a share in David. So off we go. Now, how does Rehoboam... The other interesting thing is, in this version, is that Rehoboam gets fleshed out a bit more. Rehoboam's just an idiot in 1 Kings, but in this version, he has a bit of a change of heart. He actually turns out to be not so bad. He does a lot of building up of Jerusalem and Judah in general. And he also repents of all his nonsense. And he ends up really being quite blessed. And there's this other detail. This is the detail that you noticed about the Levites. But what I noticed is they all come back. They all come back to Jerusalem, even the ones that had not been there before. They all came back. And I'm thinking, well, in the context of this story of gathering, the message is, come back, come to Jerusalem. I'm getting the importance to everyone of come back. But particularly this thing about, well, people have done it before. Look, these guys did it before. And also the supreme importance of Jerusalem above anywhere else in Israel. It's like, no, we're totally focused on this now, so this is what you need to come back to.
Exactly. And that's the context, isn't it? They're the eyes that we're looking at this through, and the significance of Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple is core to the way they tell their story. And yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at, the idea that the Levites, the Levites, as I said, they didn't have any land. So when faced with the split of the 10 tribes in the north and the 2 tribes in the south, that is Judah and Benjamin, they're like, well, we've got to go where the temple is, which is in Jerusalem. So they'll peg it down to Jerusalem and establish themselves within the southern kingdom. But also, interestingly, it says, so does the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, if you might remember that Ephraim and Manasseh were the sons of Joseph, who was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. So Ephraim and Manasseh I always think it's interesting that they're there because Joseph was really Jacob's favourite son, which is why he got into such trouble with his other brothers, of course. And he has 2 sons himself. So the 2 grandsons of Jacob, Ephraim and Manasseh, they're also kind of favourites, really. And so they almost form 2 separate tribes, even though they're the grandchildren of Jacob. And then, interestingly, Simeon is also absorbed into Judah alongside Benjamin. So we've got really the tribes of Ephraim, Manasseh, Simeon, Judah, and Benjamin absorbed within this southern kingdom, which we generally know as Judah. Just a bit of historical context there, because I think that makes a lot of sense when the people that are coming back from Babylon are principally Judeans. And I think it's also important to recognise that when we think about Jesus is part of this group who descended from these Judeans. It's a Judean. We talk about, in the New Testament, we read about Judea and Samaria. It's Judea, Galilee, and Samaria. That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so Samaria was the capital that the other nation was building, that was sort of in opposition or not trusted, or they went from being kind of brothers and sisters to distant cousins, sort of thing, and not trusted. So it's really interesting how that shifted. And as you say, people were looking for the coming kingdom of God, but which direction were they looking in? It looks to me like they were very much looking backwards for their inspiration to go forwards.
Yes, exactly.
So they were saying, the kingdom that we think God would want us to have is all gathered in one place. We were scattered, so now we want to be gathered. We've been without a good king, so now we want to have a good king. And we were at a temple because we've lost the temple. So clearly we need a temple. And the desires to bring those things back, combined with this idea that if they did, then that would be paradise again. That would be the regaining of the kingdom of God. I would say that has been a major shaping of history. You can look through how that has had an effect throughout history, especially in Jesus' time. The people who were so desperate to have a temple, they got their way shortly before Jesus was born. They got it by cozying up with the Romans. And they got it by cozying up with the Herods in particular. Now, what good did that do for Israel? You can ask. But Herod knew what he was doing. Herod knew that he could control that region if he could control the people by giving them a temple. And so this desire to come back and have temple life again was extremely strong. And not everybody thought that was the way of the kingdom. There were others, the Pharisees instead, who thought the way of the kingdom was to be the temple, to take temple life with you, to wash your hands in ceremonial washings like you do at the temple, to do that at home, to gather in synagogues instead of having to gather with just with the priests, not to worship other gods, but because God would be with them, and they were hoping that the law would be written on their hearts. They were promised. They were carrying around those things. So they fell out, these Pharisees and the Sadducees, over these different visions. Who could agree then at the time what the kingdom would look like? Well, the one thing we know is that neither of those groups of people recognized it in Jesus. Neither of them recognized the authority of Jesus when he asserted it. So, in terms of what does this mean for us? What does any of this mean for us? What do you think we can learn from it, and what do you think might be the sort of dangers of pulling bits out of context?
Do you know, I wonder if I can ask you that question, because I think it gives you the opportunity to talk about I will forgive their sin and heal their land. Does that sound all right?
So there is a particular it's not like I dislike this, because I really, it is a beautiful, beautiful verse.
Yes.
I've just heard it quoted so many times, and I believe probably in very good faith by people in prayer meetings.
Yeah.
And people earnestly quoting from Solomon's prayer in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Isn't that lovely?
Yeah. Now, where have you heard that used then?
So, but doesn't that sound like something we'd want, right?
It sounds very noble. Very noble.
Yes, and you get together in a prayer meeting and you share all the things you're worried about. If it's one of those sort of prayer meetings where you're not just looking at yourselves and your church issues, but you're trying to pray for the nation and pray for the world, this verse often comes out. But what do people mean by it? This is the thing. It's like I think we can approach it in at least a couple of ways. From my experience, when I pray it, I want to pray, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves, that means I need to humble myself. I need to seek God's face. I need to turn from my wicked ways. And then I am very confident that this promise gets fulfilled, that we'll hear from heaven and we'll receive forgiveness of sin and healing. That's brilliant. I love it. Nothing wrong with that. The problem comes when, in the context of a praying for other people or praying for the nation sort of prayer meeting, what we might mean by it is, oh God, I'm so sorry for all our horrible sins that we as a nation have committed. All these things that other people, not us obviously, other people have been horrible. All these crimes that are going. Oh God, I'm so sorry for other people and all their crimes. Oh God, I'm so sorry for all the ways in which we've lost our traditions and it doesn't look like it used to when I was growing up. And God, I'm so sorry. And in particular, and this is what really irks me, people will have prayed in terms of, oh God, I'm so sorry that our nation has said yes to gay marriage and things like that. Because for goodness sake, that's not your sin. That is not being humble and praying and seeking God's face. That is being accusing of other people, to say, oh God, could you just fix the problems that other people have done and then come and bless us? And to carry some of the other sort of ideas and beliefs from this section of the Bible, that if we do that, if we somehow bring to God the sins of other people and he'll forgive us because of the purity of our prayers for them, then somehow our nation, literally our nation, will be healed and changed, is total nonsense. I'm sorry, that's how I feel about it. You may disagree. As you listen, you may disagree, and I can understand the disagreement if you feel that wholeheartedly you feel part of something that you want to be different. We want our society to be different and better. I would agree with that. Where I would disagree is the feeling that we can pray for other people to be forgiven for their sins and ignore the fact that where God's doing his work, that I see it the most strongly and we have to feel it the most strongly, and where we have to learn and grow and change the most is in us. And the path to that is to actually be humble and pray and seek God's face for us. And what I've found God does in response to that, to be honest with you, is just give us the ability to love. And where the ability and the ability to love isn't just a nice feeling. The ability to love is the ability to cope with difficulty in relationships with other people, and especially where we don't see eye to eye, and especially where we don't agree and they don't do all the things that we would do if we were them. But the ability to love takes us well beyond having to fuss about that. And into the territory of, well, how does God see this person that I didn't know? How does God see them? What can God do through me, through us collectively, to share more love and share encouragement? Which is not the same as saying, accept everything that's wrong. It's just saying, well, God, change us and make us more loving primarily. And that's very different from praying these weird judgmental prayers.
Yeah, and it's so true, isn't it? We hear these things repeatedly. Particularly if you've been part of a Christian church for a long time, you're going to hear refrains. You're going to hear verses read from the Bible, which are compelling and kind of like they are kind of what's the word? They live deep within you, in your memory, but there is a real danger, of course, in taking those things completely out of context. I really appreciate you sharing that, Bern, because obviously that's something that you feel passionate about, but also it's a good example of something being taken right out of context and just applied in a way that perhaps is unhelpful in our day and age. We've got more of Chronicles to come, haven't we?
We do. We're going to finish it next week. We're going to see where it all goes. So we'll listen to the rest and see what you think about it next week.
Yeah, we look forward to sharing with you then. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
Bye.